She was a young woman who always felt different from others, while her friends spent time dreaming about careers, marriage, and adventures. She often found peace in quiet prayer. She loved the calm silence of the small church in her village, the sound of the choir singing softly, and the way sunlight fell across the stained glass windows. From childhood, she felt a pull, a quiet voice inside her heart that told her she was meant for something deeper, something sacred. Her parents noticed her devotion. They saw her spending hours reading the scriptures while other children played outside. They admired her faith, though sometimes they worried she was isolating herself too much. But for her, this was not a burden, it was a source of comfort. Whenever she faced challenges in life, she turned to prayer, and somehow, she always found strength as she grew older. The feeling only became stronger. She joined the choir, helped the poor in her community, and spent long hours in service at the church. The priest often told her she had a pure heart, a gift of compassion that not everyone possessed. People in the village began to whisper that she was destined to choose a path of devotion. They saw in her eyes a calmness that was rare, a sense of peace that made her stand apart. By the time she reached her late teens, she no longer doubted her calling. While her friends dreamed about starting families of their own, she dreamed about dedicating her life to God. For her, the world outside felt loud and restless. But inside the church, she found a peace that no one could take away. She believed with all her heart that her purpose was to serve, and she was ready to let go of everything else. Her family was divided when she shared her decision. Her mother cried, worried that she was giving up the chance to experience life as a wife and mother. Her father, however, looked at her with quiet pride. He understood that a true calling could not be ignored, even though it hurt them to know she would live a different kind of life. They supported her choice. They believed that if this was God's will, then they could not stand in the way. The news spread through the small town, and people reacted in different ways. Some admired her bravery, saying she was pure and chosen. Others shook their heads, thinking she was too young to make such a lifelong decision. But no matter what others thought, she remained steady. Her eyes were always calm, her voice always gentle, as she explained to anyone who asked, "This is where my heart belongs." The months leading up to the ceremony were filled with preparation. She spent time in deep prayer, fasting, and reflection. She practiced humility, wearing simple clothes and giving away many of her belongings. She wanted to walk into her new life free of attachment. Focused only on her faith, the other sisters in the convent guided her, teaching her the ways of service, prayer, and discipline. She followed their instructions with dedication, grateful for the chance to learn. Her nights were often spent alone with her thoughts. Sometimes she wondered what her life would have been if she had chosen differently. Would she have fallen in love, raised children, traveled the world? She thought about it, but never with regret. For her, this was not a sacrifice, but a blessing. The joy she felt in her heart was greater than any doubts that passed through her mind. The day of the ceremony finally arrived. It was a bright morning, and the bells of the church rang louder than ever. Villagers dressed in their finest clothes came to witness the event. The air was filled with reverence, and the old stone church glowed with candlelight and flowers. She walked slowly down the aisle, her white robe simple but radiant. Her hands were folded in prayer, her eyes lowered in humility, her heart raced. Not with fear, but with devotion. Every step she took felt like she was walking closer to her true purpose. She could feel the presence of something greater guiding her. The bishop waited at the altar, ready to welcome her into a life of sacred vows. The congregation watched in silence, admiring the courage of a young woman who was willing to dedicate everything she had to faith. In that moment, she felt a deep calm within her soul. She believed with all her heart that she was stepping into her destiny. Everything in her life had led her to this single moment. She was certain that this was the path she was meant to follow. Little did she know, however, that destiny had a secret waiting for her. A truth that would reveal itself just as she was about to complete her vows. A truth so powerful that even the bishop himself would be forced to stop the ceremony. The morning of the ceremony arrived, and the entire village gathered at the church. The sound of bells filled the air, echoing across the rooftops. Families dressed in their best clothes made their way down the cobblestone streets, whispering about the young woman who had chosen to give her life to God. Inside the church, the smell of incense drifted through the air. Candles flickered gently, and the choir prepared to sing hymns of devotion. She stood in a small room at the side of the church, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her simple white robe. It was not a robe of luxury, but of humility, plain and unadorned, symbolizing her choice to leave behind the world's temptations. Her heart was racing, yet her face was calm. She whispered a prayer under her breath, thanking God for giving her the strength to reach this moment. The sisters of the convent stood nearby, their expressions filled with pride and encouragement. They had guided her for months, teaching her how to live with discipline and grace. One of them leaned closer and whispered, "Today you step into eternity." Those words filled her with a quiet joy. She felt ready, more ready than ever before. The church doors opened, and she stepped forward. The sight before her took her breath away. The pews were filled with people from every corner of the village. All eyes fixed on her. Some looked with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with doubt. But she did not waver. Each step she took down the aisle felt heavy with meaning. Her sandals tapped softly against the stone floor, her folded hands resting against her chest. The choir began to sing, their voices rising like wings. The melody echoed through the walls, blending with the soft light streaming in from stained glass windows. The bishop stood at the altar, tall and solemn, his eyes following her with a calm intensity. He had overseen many ceremonies in his life, but something about this one felt different. There was a weight in the air, an unspoken sense that something unusual was about to unfold. She reached the altar and knelt down. Her head bowed, her heart steady. The bishop raised his hand in blessing, his voice deep and steady as he began the prayers. The congregation listened silently. Some wept softly, moved by the beauty of the moment. Others clasped their hands tightly, whispering prayers of their own. As the ritual continued, everything followed tradition. The lighting of candles, the recitation of vows, the hymns sung by the choir, yet beneath the perfection of ritual. There was a tension building, unseen but felt. The bishop's eyes often returned to her, studying her more closely than he had studied anyone before. It was as if something about her was calling out to him, something that did not belong to the usual flow of ceremony. Her voice trembled slightly as she repeated the words of devotion, promising to give her life to God. Her words echoed in the vast church, carrying both innocence and strength. The bishop nodded slowly, but his gaze lingered. He noticed small details others could not see: the way her hands shook, the way her eyes flickered for a moment, the way her presence seemed both fragile and powerful at once. The crowd was captivated, holding its breath as the ceremony drew closer to its climax. This was the moment where she would fully step into her new life, where she would no longer belong to herself, but to faith. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The candles flickered more wildly, the choir's voices trembled, and the silence of the congregation grew deeper. Just before the final vow, the bishop leaned forward. His voice faltered for the briefest moment. He looked at her more intently, his eyes narrowing as if he had seen something no one else had noticed. The congregation shifted in their seats, sensing his hesitation, but unaware of what it meant. She lifted her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for the first time during the entire ceremony. In that single glance, the bishop felt a wave of recognition. A realization that shook him to his core. It was not fear in her eyes, not doubt, it was something else. Something hidden, something unusual. The bishop's hand lowered. His voice stopped mid-sentence. A hush fell over the church. The choir went silent. The prayers halted. The air itself seemed to freeze. The villagers looked around in confusion, wondering what had just happened. Why would a ceremony so sacred be interrupted? The bishop stared at her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. But his silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. Something had shifted. Something had been revealed. And though no one else could see it, he knew in his heart that this ceremony could not continue. The church was silent. Every whisper, every sound of breathing, every shuffle of feet seemed to stop at once. The bishop had lowered his hand, his eyes fixed on the young woman kneeling before him. For a moment, no one understood what was happening. Why would the ceremony pause? Why would a vow so sacred be interrupted? The young woman felt the weight of his gaze. Her heart pounded, her hands trembled slightly. She had prepared for this moment for months. But now, standing at the edge of her new life, she could feel something shifting. She kept her head bowed, waiting for the bishop to continue. But instead, he took a step back, his face tense. The congregation leaned forward in their seats, trying to see what the bishop had noticed. Mothers clutched their children close. Old men squinted their eyes. And the sisters of the convent whispered among themselves. None of them could see what the bishop saw, but all of them could feel the tension rising. The bishop studied her carefully. His eyes moved from her folded hands to her face, and then to the small details others would not notice. It was in the way her eyes glistened under the candlelight, the faint mark on her wrist, the unusual calmness in her expression. For a moment, it felt as if time slowed, as if he was being shown something no one else was meant to see. Finally, he raised his voice, low but steady. "We must stop," he said. The words echoed through the church like thunder. The congregation gasped. Some stood in shock, unable to believe what they had just heard. The ceremony was sacred, something rarely interrupted. To stop it was unheard of. The young woman lifted her head, her eyes wide. She searched the bishop's face for answers, but he only shook his head slightly, as though confirming to himself that what he saw was true. She whispered softly, "Have I done something wrong?" Her voice trembled with fear and confusion. The bishop's hand trembled as he pointed gently toward her wrist. The faint mark that others had ignored seemed to glow under the light of the candles. It was not a scar, not a bruise, but something different, a symbol, a sign, something ancient that carried meaning beyond simple explanation. The bishop recognized it instantly. He had read about it in old texts, heard whispers of it in stories passed down through generations. The congregation followed his gaze. Some gasped, others squinted, trying to understand what they were seeing, but none of them recognized it the way the bishop did. For him, it was a mark that spoke of destiny, a mark that did not belong to a nun's life. It was a calling, yes, but a calling of another kind. Whispers filled the church. What is happening? Why did he stop? What does he see? The sisters looked at one another in confusion. Unable to explain the interruption, the atmosphere grew heavier, as though the walls themselves were holding secrets. The bishop spoke again, his voice stronger now. "This ceremony cannot continue," he declared. His words sent a shockwave through the congregation. People murmured, some in disbelief, some in anger, and some in fear. The young woman's family stood frozen, torn between pride, shame, and worry. Tears welled in her eyes. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, prepared her heart, given up everything, and now, in front of the entire village, she was being told it could not happen. She pressed her hands together tightly, whispering a prayer. asking why fate had chosen this moment to change her path. The bishop's expression softened. He stepped closer. Kneeling so that his voice reached only her child, he whispered, "There is something in you that cannot be bound by this vow. You carry a sign, a truth, a destiny that is greater than what is before us now." His words confused her even more. But in his eyes, she saw no anger, only compassion. The people demanded answers. Some cried out. "Explain," others shouted. "Let her continue." But the bishop stood firm. He raised his hand for silence. And when the church grew quiet again, he said, "What I have observed cannot be ignored. To proceed would be to deny what is written upon her. This is not the end of her journey, but the beginning of another." The congregation sat in stunned silence. No one understood what it meant. No one knew what the unusual sign truly represented. But one thing was certain: the ceremony could not go on. Her life was no longer following the path she had chosen. It was being guided by something greater, something unseen, something that even the bishop dared not fully reveal. The young woman lowered her head once more. But this time, not in humility. Her mind raced, her heart heavy. She had stepped into the church ready to dedicate herself to God. But she was leaving with questions she had never imagined. She did not yet know what the mark meant, or why the bishop had stopped her, but deep down, she felt the same truth he had seen. Her journey was not over, it had only just begun. The church that had been filled with joy only moments ago now stood frozen in silence. The bishop's words echoed again and again in everyone's ears. "This ceremony cannot continue." The villagers shifted uncomfortably. Unsure of what it meant, some whispered in anger, others in fear. But no one dared to speak loudly. The air was heavy, charged with the weight of something extraordinary. The young woman knelt there, her heart trembling. She had given everything to this moment, left behind her old life, and prepared her soul for the sacred vow. Now, in front of everyone she loved, the bishop had stopped her. Her eyes burned with tears. Yet she forced herself to remain calm. She believed in faith. And faith meant trusting even when she did not understand. The bishop stepped closer, his voice lowered but filled with authority. "This is not a punishment," he said. "It is not rejection. It is revelation." His words sent chills through the crowd. He gestured toward her wrist, the unusual mark glowing faintly under the candlelight. "This sign is not a mistake. It is a gift, a message written upon her life." Gasps filled the church. People leaned forward, trying to understand. The old women crossed themselves, muttering prayers. Some young men shook their heads, refusing to believe in signs and symbols. Yet no one could deny the truth. The bishop had seen something unusual, something that could not be explained away. The young woman finally lifted her voice, trembling but steady. "If not this path, then what?" she asked. Her question hung in the air like a bell. Her whole life had been leading to this moment, and now that the path was closed, she felt lost. "Tell me, Father," she whispered. "What am I meant to be?" The bishop's eyes softened. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "You were chosen," he said, "but not for the life you thought. The vows of a nun are sacred, yes, but your mark speaks of another kind of calling, one that reaches beyond these walls, beyond this convent, beyond this village." His voice shook slightly as he added, "You are meant to walk among the people, to heal, to guide, to carry light in places where no one else dares to go." The congregation murmured again. Some believed him, others doubted. "How can this be?" they asked. "How can she, a simple girl, carry such destiny?" But the bishop did not argue. He stood firm, raising his voice so all could hear. "The hand of God does not choose by accident. When destiny reveals itself, we must listen." Her family, sitting in the front row, broke down in tears. They had supported her choice to become a nun even when it was painful. Now, hearing the bishop's words, they realized she was not being taken from them into silence. She was being sent back to the world, but with a purpose far greater than they had imagined. The choir remained silent, their hymn unfinished. The candles flickered wildly. As though they too were reacting to the weight of the moment, the villagers sat in awe, realizing they were witnesses to something that would be told and retold for generations. A ceremony meant to bind a woman to the convent had instead revealed a destiny larger than the convent itself. The young woman rose slowly to her feet, her robe still flowing around her, her face streaked with tears. But her eyes now carried a strange new strength. She no longer felt fear. She no longer felt small, though her vow was not completed. Her spirit felt lifted, as though she had been unchained. Released into something greater, she looked around at the people who had gathered. And for the first time, she felt not only their stares, but their need. They were waiting for someone to lead, to inspire, to guide. The bishop raised his hand once more. "This is not an ending," he said firmly. "This is a beginning." His words were met with silence. And then, slowly, with nods, the villagers began to understand. The woman they thought would disappear behind convent walls would instead walk among them, carrying with her a purpose no one had foreseen. The ceremony ended not with vows, but with revelation. The bells rang again, not in celebration of a nun's life, but in recognition of something even greater. The villagers left the church whispering to one another, their voices filled with wonder. Some said it was destiny, others called it a miracle. But all agreed that they had witnessed history. As the young woman stepped outside into the sunlight, she felt the breeze on her face for the first time. She did not feel bound to a single path. Her life was open, wide, and full of mystery. She carried with her the bishop's words, the mark on her wrist, and the heavy knowledge that her story had only just begun. She had walked into the church believing she was surrendering her life. Instead, she walked out realizing her life was being returned to her, not for herself, but for the world. The path of a nun had closed, but another path had opened, one that no one, not even she, could have imagined.